October. The sisters of Phi Alpha Pi were settled into their daily routines. The sorority house was busy with sisters in the main living areas. The study room was constantly in use, the dining room often occupied, and there was typically a group watching something on television. Daytimes were often filled with soap operas, evenings with popular primetime shows, and weekends with movies and Netflix series. One of the sisters had taken the time to print a schedule of what days and times were assigned to specific viewings. This was also the time of year when living arrangements got stressful. Roommates often fought. Some sisters moved out, and others moved in. New pledges were in the house all the time as they learned about the sorority. Jane was constantly on the watch for hazing. "You haven't been spending a lot of time with Charlie," Lizbeth observed as she and Jane sat in the living room with their laptops open and books scattered around. "We've both been so busy," Jane said as she looked around the room. "We grab coffee and then, have to get to something else. It's the pledges that take most of my time." Lizbeth watched as Jane turned around in her chair. Lydia was sitting behind them with her new little sister, a girl named Katie. "You can ask for help. I can make sure they aren't hazed. You can go spend time at Charlie's house." "That's very sweet, but it's my responsibility." Lizbeth debated pushing her friend, but nobody was as vigilant about hazing as Jane was. "Will joined us for coffee the other day," Jane said. "Oh, I rarely see him in class," Lizbeth said. I think I saw him last weekend at the party. He was saying some nonsense about how a pretty pair of eyes could make any woman beautiful, and he needs a freaking haircut." Lizbeth didn't tell Jane how, later that night, she had stood in front of the bathroom mirror wondering about her own blue eyes. Lizbeth looked like her mother with dark brown wavy hair. She didn't wear much makeup, favoring a natural look. Her eyes were a point of pride, and she liked to draw attention to them. Her mother said her father's sapphire blue eyes were the first thing she had ever noticed about him. She was in denial that she had been thinking about Will and his eyes, which were as green as new leaves in spring.
"OMG, Lizbeth, just fuck him already,"
Lydia called from behind them. "What?" Lizbeth asked. "Will is all you talk about. Will this and will that. It's clear you want to fuck him, so just do it." Lizbeth bristled at the idea. "I don't want to fuck him. I don't like him," Lizbeth said. She looked at Jane, who sat there with a look of curiosity. "Okay, whatever," Lydia said. In the middle of October, Lizbeth found something to distract her from thoughts of Will. She had to think about what she wanted to do after graduation. Her parents had few expectations for her, as long as she was happy with her choices. Dr. Bennett, more than anyone else, put on the pressure about graduate school. "Duke has been in touch with me," Dr. Bennett said one afternoon as they sat in his office reviewing some details about her thesis. "Duke? Why?" "I have a colleague out there, and I have been telling her about your research. They are considering developing some type of gender studies master's program. You would be a perfect fit." "I'm not sure I want to focus on gender studies. I feel like that limits me to academia." "There's nothing wrong with academia." "No, you're right, but getting a job in something like gender studies is difficult. Plus, I'm not sure I want to get a PhD. "Don't worry. I'm pretty sure they won't get this program off the ground. They have been talking about it for 20 years. Will you just meet with their admissions rep anyway? He's coming all the way out here to meet with you and tell you about the program. Maybe there will be another program there for you." This was how Lizbeth met Jorge. He was one of those guys who was more than aware that he was attractive. His hazel eyes sparkled with a playfulness that was probably useful for working in admissions. His dark tan and milk chocolate brown curls set off those hazel eyes beautifully. Lizbeth felt really comfortable talking with him over dinner, feigning interest in the graduate school so they could keep talking. She hadn't felt this attracted to someone in months. "You don't look that interested in the program," Jorge said with a laugh. They had been chatting for 90 minutes, but not about the programs at Duke. Instead, they had commiserated about being a Yankee in the South. Jorge had grown up in New York City and visited Boston many times. "I'm sorry. I told Dr. Bennett I'd talk to you, but Duke just isn't on my radar." "I understand. I go where I am bidden. I took one look at your information and knew we didn't have what you wanted." "Really?" Lizbeth said. "Yeah, you're a Yankee girl who needs an Ivy League program. I'm shocked you're down here." "There were other factors that brought me here," Lizbeth said. She could feel herself blushing, but wasn't sure why. "I'm glad I came." "Really? Why?" "You are far more interesting in person than most of the students I meet." Lizbeth didn't know what to say, so she did what Jane usually suggested, and smiled. "Okay, I'm declaring this interview over. I want to make sure you know it's over because I want you to have dinner with me tonight. And I don't want you to feel obligated because of my job." "Really?" Lizbeth said as she cocked an eyebrow. "That's refreshing." They both laughed at this. That dinner was the first of 3 they had before Jorge had to leave town. Lizbeth felt comfortable spending the night at his hotel before he went back to North Carolina. "I'll be back in a few days," Jorge said as he packed the next morning. Lizbeth was still in his bed and the TV was on. "Do you want to meet some of the people who brought me to Georgia?" she asked. "We can do dinner after the open house next week." "I'd like that," Lizbeth said with a smile. He leaned over and kissed her on the lips, as if to seal the deal. He was back a few days later for the graduate school open house run by the university. Mrs. C, upon discovering that Lizbeth was seeing someone, insisted on inviting him over for dinner after the open house. Before Lizbeth left for the event with Charlotte and Jane, Mrs. C asked her to walk home with Colin, who was also coming over for dinner. Lizbeth wondered if Mrs. C was now trying to secure her son a position at Duke. The open house was very well attended. Charlie and Will were talking to some Ivy League reps. "They're both considering MBAs, Jane explained, and Lizbeth wasn't surprised. "What are you two considering?" Lizbeth asked her 2 best friends. "I don't know if I really want to go to graduate school," Charlotte said, with a sigh. Charlotte often had multiple plans in the works. She had a difficult time committing to one because she was constantly planning and watching, trying to pick the best option for herself. Lizbeth understood why. Charlotte had grown up in Flint, Michigan. Her family had nothing. Charlotte had earned everything she got. She was in school on a full scholarship. She had to keep her grades up, which required constant work. Charlotte also had the disadvantage of being an art major. Charlotte was an amazing artist, but couldn't identify a career she wanted with a degree. She didn't want to go into computer graphic design, which would be the practical choice. She didn't want to teach, which would mean job security. But she wanted a life like the one Lizbeth had grown up in. "What you really need is a rich patron to pay you to make art for her," Lizbeth said with a smile. It was a joke Charlotte had often made herself, and she giggled in response. "I'm still thinking education," Jane said. Jane was a talented graphic designer, but refused to make it her major or consider it a career. It frustrated Lizbeth that, instead of jumping into a career doing what she loved, Jane was going to be an art teacher. She knew Jane was worried that she didn't have the right personality for the aggressive tech industry. That didn't stop Lizbeth from pushing Jane's buttons when it felt right. Today was not the day to do that. "Do you want to meet Jorge?" Lizbeth asked.
Yes,
both Charlotte and Jane said at the same time. Lizbeth stopped at a table for Columbia and Harvard on the way to the Duke table. She was growing tired of the Southern lifestyle and wanted to get back to the Northeast. Columbia had a human rights program that piqued her interest. Harvard had a social policy program that wasn't exactly what she wanted, but would bring her home. Charlotte stopped at almost every table, grabbing information about nothing specific. Jane picked up very little and didn't seem worried about finding a program for education. By the time they got to the Duke table, it was almost the end of the event, and they found Jorge alone. "Hi," he said when he saw Lizbeth. "Can I have a few moments to tell you about our Lord and Savior, basketball?" "I'm a sports atheist," Lizbeth said with a smile. "But my friends Jane and Charlotte have yet to be saved." "It's wonderful to finally meet the infamous Jane and Charlotte," I've heard quite a bit about you from Lizbeth, Jorge said with a smile. There has been a change in plans. Our house mother, Mrs. C, has invited you to join us for dinner at the house. Do you mind? Feel free to say no. Dinner at a sorority house happens to be on my bucket list. We can go out for drinks after. I promise to make it up to you. No, I'll have to reward you for helping me check off another item on my bucket list. The four of them talked about the other universities they had seen at the event. Charlotte continued her general review of the universities present, and Jane kept looking around. Lizbeth assumed for Charlie. Jorge started packing up his booth. He was looking away when Jane spotted Charlie and waved him over. Wil came with him and kept staring at Lizbeth. Lizbeth, Wil said. Hello. Are the two of you considering Duke? That was when Jorge turned around. No, actually, I'm not, Charlie said. This is Jorge, the admissions rep from Duke. He has been on camp. I know who he is, Wil said. Jorge. William. Wil turned and walked away without another word. Charlie smiled at Jane, but followed his friend. What was that? Lizbeth asked when the two men were gone. It's a very long story, Jorge said. Fair ladies, Lizbeth heard a voice from behind them say as they left the student union with Jorge.
Sorry, Lizbeth whispered while they waited for Colin Collins to catch up with them.
He's Mrs. C's son, and she asked us to bring him back to the house with us for dinner. Here I thought I was the guest of honor, Jorge said with a sigh. Lizbeth was relieved that the odd interaction with Wil was now forgotten. Oh, you are, Lizbeth said. Keep that in mind with Mrs. C. Lizbeth turned around to see a very disheveled Colin Collins running to catch up with them. At the start of the semester, he had seemed much more put together than he did now. Colin, this is Jorge from Duke. He is joining us for dinner tonight. My mother is very excited about meeting you.
My father was a Duke alumnus and raised us on basketball.
Did you go to Duke as well? I would imagine being an alumnus would make it very easy to sell the virtues of such a wonderful university. My father felt I'd be a natural fit at Duke, especially in their law program. My mentor married a Duke alumnus and always speaks favorably of the university. I decided against law,
but Duke has a special place in my heart.
Lizbeth allowed Colin to continue his monologue the whole way back to the Phi Alpha Pi house. She and Jorge fell behind the group. I don't want to pry, but I'm so very curious about what happened between you and Wil back there, Lizbeth said. Do you know him? Unfortunately, his roommate Charlie and Jane are dating. Caroline, Charlie's sister, is a member of the sorority. Will she be at dinner tonight? No, she doesn't live in the house.
Why?
It's a long story. I have time. After dinner. I don't want to be overheard, and it's private. Dinner was, as usual, dominated by Colin and Mrs. C. This time they were talking about how amazing Duke was. Mrs. C kept insisting that Colin should attend their law school after he has his MBA. Lydia and Mrs. C seemed to be thick as thieves as well. Lydia kept complimenting the meal and agreeing with their house mother about random things. Lizbeth had noticed that Mrs. C got along better with Lydia than any other sorority officer. It was another thing she made a mental note to monitor. Lizbeth kept dwelling on that one brief moment between Jorge and Wil. After dinner, she and Jorge went down to a local bar together before spending the night in his hotel room. I'm coming back through here on Halloween. Want to do something? Jorge said between kisses. They were sitting at a back table in a dark area of the bar, kissing and touching. Lizbeth found herself smiling more than usual. I have a Halloween party that night, but maybe you can come to it, Lizbeth said without thinking. Wait, Wil will be there. The party is at his house. You said you would tell me about Wil. Jorge stopped touching her and sat up in his chair. He leaned forward and put his forearms on the table. I sort of grew up with Wil, but I'm a few years older, Jorge said, and started playing with the label on his bottle of beer. Really? Lizbeth said, sitting up herself. My father worked for Wil's father. He was property manager for the real estate Wil's family owns. Childhood friends, actually. My father was practically an equal business partner.
Wow. It's weird to think of Wil as a child.
He wasn't very friendly with me, but I was at their home nearly every day. His sister Ginny loved me. She's very different from Wil. They're like night and day. His father also adored me, and when my father died, the family promised to take care of me. What about Wil's mother? What about your mother? My parents are divorced, and my mother ran off when I was very young. I haven't seen or heard from her since. Wil's mother died from a very aggressive breast cancer a few years after Ginny was born. When Wil's father got sick with pancreatic cancer, he told me he made sure I would be taken care of. Wil had other plans when it came time to make good on the promise. It had not been left in the will, so I had no legal recourse. I got one lump sum and didn't realize it was all I had. I was at an Ivy League school and ran out of money before I could graduate. I was lucky to get a full-time job with Duke. I take classes while I work, but I really only do one at a time. Wil refused to give you what his father promised? Yeah, and he cut all ties with me too. Ginny tried to keep in touch for a while, but Wil shut that down when he found out. He threatened legal action if I didn't leave her alone. Lizbeth had heard Caroline mention Jenny when they were all at the townhouse working on the French project. Caroline explained that Ginny was at a boarding school about an hour away. Wil had transferred, partly to be closer to his sister. Charlie and Caroline had come to keep him company. Now Lizbeth wondered if it was to make sure Wil could control his sister and keep Jorge away from her. She didn't mention this to Jorge. You should come to the party, Lizbeth said, after thinking about what Jorge had told her. Really? Show him you're the bigger person and can do fine without him. It's a good idea. It's not like I'm in the wrong. If he doesn't like it, he can leave.
Lizbeth, Colin said, sitting down right next to her with an overeager look on his face. I spoke with my mentor, Miss Catherine de Bourgh, today. She is very pleased with the progress I have been making this year. She told me her nephew Wil is at school here this year and is in this class. I must make a point of introducing myself to him. To make things better, she has offered me an internship for class credit starting in the spring. I may have to head over to Gardner in Massachusetts this November to get set up and settled. There is a second internship available. Mother thinks it's important for me to find a wife who shares my interests and will allow me to focus on my work. Catherine de Bourgh has offered to provide a second internship if I do have a wife. They both have convinced me a wife would, additionally, put me in a better social standing. My position would be one of great responsibility and prominence in her company. Miss de Bourgh has often complimented my ideas on running her company. I really feel like this is my chance to put these ideas in action. It was Monday, in their gender class. Lizbeth was fighting the urge to start an argument with Wil. She wasn't in the mood to deal with Colin. She was saved from both Colin and herself when Professor Bennet arrived and began his lecture. Lizbeth focused on her notes and got out of class quickly before Colin could catch up with her. She remembered, as she walked back to the house, that her father, a well-known chef in Boston, knew Catherine de Bourgh. She was curious about a woman who connected Wil and Colin to each other.
She texted both her father and Jorge, hoping one would tell her about this woman. She never heard from Jorge,
but her father quickly replied, "Stay away from her. She's a judgmental control freak who thinks anyone that doesn't fit her ideal is not worth her time." The sorority sisters had spent weeks planning their costumes for Charlie and Caroline's Halloween party. Most of the sorority sisters had decided to dress up as something sexy. Cheerleader, witch, cat, zombie, pirate, along with some weird costumes that should never be sexy, like characters from children's television shows. Jane had a current obsession with sewing. She had designed and made costumes for herself, Lizbeth, and Charlotte. "We are going to be Regency-era ladies," Jane said as she showed her friends their Empire waist dresses. Charlotte's was a lovely navy blue linen with light pink trims. Lizbeth's was Chardonnay colored with navy trims. Jane's was light pink with light blue trims. Lizbeth had been instructed to provide bonnets and gloves. She had gotten all of them elbow-length silk gloves and straw bonnets thanks to the internet. Charlotte had picked out ribbons from Jane's specifications and edged the bonnets with them. They looked right out of an Austen novel. Marie came into Lizbeth and Jane's room as they were all getting ready. "I'm a ghost," Marie said. "With a sheet over you?" Lizbeth asked. "No, more with makeup." A sexy ghost? Charlotte asked. Marie rolled her eyes, but knew Charlotte was being sarcastic. No, just a ghost. Well, a ghost bride. I found a cheap wedding dress on eBay. I tore it up to look like I was buried in it. I need help with the makeup, though. I need eyeliner all around my eyes, and I suck at applying it. Jane helped Marie with her makeup, and all four were very pleased with their costumes. Lizbeth drove them to the townhouse. She didn't expect them all to return. She gave Marie an extra set of keys,
in case Lizbeth decided to go back to Jorge's hotel room.
Lizbeth wanted this party to reinvigorate Jane's relationship with Charlie. Charlotte had commented that Charlie was likely to get bored if Jane didn't spend more time with him. Both Lizbeth and Charlotte knew Jane had moved faster than she normally did, but then she had backed off recently and not spent much time with Charlie. Jane's friends knew it was her shyness and anxiety. Lizbeth hoped Jane would drink just enough to help her nerves. The driveway was full when they got to the townhouse. Lizbeth took the last available guest spot. The party was in full swing when they walked in. "Jane! Lizbeth!" Caroline called to them from across the room. Lizbeth could barely see Caroline in the crowd. The two of them waved back and made their way into the kitchen. Lizbeth made a point of getting 4 unopened beers from the fridge. "Are you supposed to be Lizzie Bennet?" Lizbeth looked up to see Wil standing behind the fridge door. How had he snuck up on her so easily? She grabbed the beers and closed the door. "Well, my name is Lizbeth. I am dressed for the correct time period," Lizbeth said and passed the beers to her friends, who took them and walked away. "I guess that's my costume." Wil looked annoyed at her sarcastic response. "You do know I'm Mr. Darcy," he said with a sigh. Lizbeth looked Wil up and down. He was wearing his normal attire. He looked striking in a thin light gray sweater, dark-washed jeans, and his black chucks. He had a knack for picking colors that made his eyes stand out. "Tonight?" "No, my last name is Darcy. I am William Darcy." "My last name isn't Bennet." "If you're not dressed as Mr. Darcy, then what is your costume? Preppy entitled rich boy?" "I'm not dressed up. I do not like dressing up and pretending to be something I'm not." "Why doesn't this surprise me?" Lizbeth said, rolling her eyes. Wil stared at her. "Are you aware that your house mother is here?" he eventually said. "Excuse me? Mrs. C is at this party?" "Yes. She seems to have come with her son, who I was not aware was invited. I have to listen to him enough in class. I thought those 2.5 hours of him a week was going to be my limit." Lizbeth looked back to see Colin and Mrs. C on the couch, each with beers in hand. Mrs. C was chatting with a group of girls who looked like they were trying to ignore her. Colin was looking around the room with a drunk expression on his face. Lizbeth could see him swaying, and his entire face seemed relaxed. "He often comes to dinner at our house. I'm sure he assumed that a party discussed in his proximity meant he was invited," Lizbeth said.
Why did his mother come with him?
Lizbeth sighed. She suspected Lydia had invited Mrs. C. She was annoyed that Wil seemed to think she was responsible for people at his party. Who knows why people do what they do?
Jorge
Wonders the same thing. Lizbeth watched Wil's green eyes narrow.
Good for Jorge,
Wil said, and walked away.
Lizbeth rolled her eyes and made her way through the townhouse looking for Jorge.
They hadn't talked much since he left campus. He had sent her a text message earlier saying he would be at the party and that she would be impressed with his costume. From what Lizbeth could tell, his costume was a cloak of invisibility because he wasn't there at all. She had never been stood up, and the feeling confused her. She stood alone in the middle of the party with nobody to talk to. All her friends had gone off on their own.
"Lizbeth, I'm so happy to have found you,"
Colin Collins said, coming up to her.
He was dressed as a clown.
Which wasn't too far off the mark in Lizbeth's opinion. "What can I do for you?" Lizbeth asked.
"I saw you speaking to Wil Darcy. His aunt is my mentor, Catherine de Bourgh. He has class with us."
"You don't say." Lizbeth knew her sarcasm was lost on Colin, but she didn't care. It wasn't uncommon for him to tell her things multiple times.
"I'm going to introduce myself to him again and make sure he knows how important I am to his aunt. He and I are sure to become good friends given our shared admiration for his aunt."
Colin, I don't think it's a good idea.
Nonsense. He and I have a lot in common.
Lizbeth put her hand on Colin's shoulder to steady him. Wait, Colin, why is your mother here?
Lydia invited us. My mother is sure Jane and Charlie are going to announce an engagement shortly and didn't want to miss it if it happened tonight,
Colin said, and left to find Wil. Lizbeth was irritated with Lydia, but wondered where Mrs. C got the idea that Charlie and Jane were getting engaged. Colin was staggering through the crowd on his way to Wil before she could ask him. Wil was speaking to one of the Alpha Phi brothers. From a distance, it looked like Colin had interrupted the conversation to talk to Wil. The look on Wil's face was one Lizbeth had seen many times, but the more Colin talked, the deeper Wil's frown became. Lizbeth felt obligated to rescue them from each other, but didn't get a chance before Wil simply turned away from Colin and returned to his original conversation. Colin stood there for a few moments, swaying from intoxication, before walking away himself. The night just got worse from there. Charlotte had disappeared. Lydia was at the center of everything, chatting with groups of people for a few minutes before moving on. Jane had run off somewhere, with, hopefully, Charlie, and usually sober Marie was nowhere to be seen. The one person she did find, Mrs. C, was drunk. The house mother loudly explained to everyone near her that Jane was soon going to marry Charlie, and all this would be Jane's. Mrs. C took credit for the entire relationship. The weirdest part of the night was a conversation she had with Caroline toward the end of the party. Caroline stalked over to Lizbeth in a leather catsuit with 3-inch heels. "Wow, Caroline, you look amazing," Lizbeth said.
"You have no idea what you're doing,"
Caroline said with a small drunk lisp.
"Excuse me?"
"You don't deserve him. You are just a little nothing."
"I don't know what they all see in you,"
Caroline said, and then stalked off with a high-pitched laugh. Lizbeth knew this was the end of the party for her.
Jorge was apparently never going to show up. She was annoyed
that she wasn't important enough to him for a text message letting her know. She was embarrassed by Colin and Mrs. C. She was still irritated from her conversation with Wil. She wanted to find Charlotte, Jane, and Marie. She roamed from room to room looking for her sorority sisters.
"Do you need something, Lizbeth?"
Wil said when she accidentally walked into his bedroom on the second floor of the townhouse. Wil was sitting at a desk with a book open and a pen in hand. "I'm looking for the friends I came with. I'm sorry. I didn't realize this was your room."
"I last saw Jane with Caroline. Marie was outside in the back, drinking and being very Socratic with a bunch of Alpha Phi brothers dressed in togas. Charlotte was kind enough to distract Colin, who appears to be my aunt's latest protege.
Jorge is not here."
Lizbeth looked around the room. She was trying to decide what to do next, but was distracted by how bare the room was. There were no posters on the wall, but Wil had put up bookcases and loaded them with books. The full-size bed was covered with a fluffy down comforter. Wil's laptop sat on the bed, and Lizbeth wanted to do the same. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. "Lizbeth, are you okay?" Wil asked. "What? Yes, I'm fine, thanks," Lizbeth said, leaving the room and closing the door behind her. She found Charlotte talking with Colin. Technically, Colin was talking and Charlotte was listening. "I hate to interrupt, but I think it is time for us to leave," Lizbeth said. "Why?" Charlotte asked. "Things are getting weird." "Well, you are the designated driver. You're sober and everyone else is drunk. Are you drunk?" "No," Charlotte said. "What's wrong?" "I'm irritated about a bunch of things."
"Like Jorge not showing up?"
"Can you help me find Jane and Marie? I want to let them know I'm going and see if they want to ride." "I think I'm going to stay a little longer," Charlotte said. "Really?" "I am happy to make sure Charlotte gets home safely, Lizbeth," Colin offered. "We'll help you find Marie and Jane," Charlotte said, and the three of them went through the house together. Marie was at the center of a group of Alpha Phi brothers dressed in togas, singing drinking songs loudly and poorly. She was so drunk she was slurring her words and could barely stand up.
Lizbeth knew enough about rape culture to know the look in the eyes of these brothers. She had to get her friend out immediately before something bad happened. "Come on, Marie. Let's get you home before the car turns back into a pumpkin," Lizbeth said, wrapping her arm around Marie's waist to support her. Lizbeth could hear the groans of disappointment as they walked away. Marie continued to try to sing the drinking songs. They found Jane standing by the front door.
"Oh, fantastic. I think it's time to leave," Jane said.
"Did something happen? You don't have to leave with me. I can take care of Marie."
"No, I want to go home."
The two friends helped Marie to the car and pulled away from the townhouse. Only Marie talked during the trip back to the sorority house as she tried to figure out more lyrics to drinking songs. Lizbeth had never seen Marie so drunk before. "Did something happen?" Lizbeth asked Jane once they got Marie into her bed.
"Nope, I just was bored."
"Where was Charlie?"
"Being the host. We spent some time together. Did you know Mrs. C and Colin were at the party?"
"Yeah, Will pointed them out," Lizbeth said, and then told Jane some of what happened to her that night. Jane didn't share any more. Lizbeth knew it would take a little time, but eventually Jane would tell her all the details.